represented here too.
Yes, welcome to alums. All right, what do you think, Jessica? Shall we go ahead and start?
Yeah.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Sharon Reed and I'm the Programs and Events Coordinator for the Hood Museum of Art at Dartmouth. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this year's Dr. Alan W. Root Distinguished Contemporary Art Lectureship. It's a rainy afternoon here in central New Hampshire, and we're cheered to see so many of you with us here today. Even if we can't see you, we know you're here with us. Today's program will run for about 1 hour, and we will have time for questions near the end of the conversation. We do encourage you to enter your questions at any time. You don't have to wait until the end. If you think of a question, you can pop it into that Q&A or chat function anytime that you wish throughout the program. We are recording, and we will make this program available on the Hood Museum of Art's YouTube channel, the link for which we will send you in a follow-up email. And now I will turn it over to my colleague, Jessica Hong, Associate Curator of Global and Contemporary Art. Jessica?
Yeah, thank you, Sharon. Good afternoon, good evening or good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Jessica Hong, and as Sharon mentioned, I'm the Associate Curator of Global Contemporary Art at the Hood Museum of Art at Dartmouth, based in Hanover, New Hampshire, which is situated upon the ancestral and unceded lands of the Abenaki peoples. And even as we're mostly engaging in the virtual sphere, I'm speaking to you from my home near Hanover. So this acknowledgement reminds us of the significance of place, the continued existence of Indigenous peoples, and the museum and Dartmouth's commitment to building respectful relationships with those who call these lands home today. So we're delighted that you're all here with us for the annual and this year virtual Dr. Alan Root Contemporary Art Distinguished Lectureship. This lecture series is named after Dr. Alan Root, an acclaimed pediatric endocrinologist who received his degree from Dartmouth in 1955 and his major pre-med in 1956. Dr. Root's children, Jennifer Mayer, who I saw in the chat, Jonathan Root, and Michael Root, who are also all distinguished medical doctors, established this lectureship in honor of their father's 70th birthday. And because of Jonathan, Jennifer, and Michael's generosity on behalf of their father, since 2003, the Hood has invited leading thinkers, artists, and cultural workers of our day to engage in critical and sustained dialogues at the museum with the Dartmouth community and our broader publics. We wish we can express our gratitude in person, but we do know that Dr. Root and the family are here with us virtually. And though we can't see you, we extend our deepest thanks to you, Michael, Jonathan, and Jennifer, and of course, to Alan Root for your kind-hearted and continuous support. I additionally want to recognize my colleagues at the Hood who work tirelessly behind the scenes. And in particular, I get to say this to Sharon's face, Sharon Reed, our programs and events manager, who brings all programs, whether it's in person or virtual, into fruition. Also, my sincerest thanks to the tech and media staff and all the departments on campus that make Dartmouth run, especially during these unprecedented and challenging times. So before we dive in, I'm going to briefly set the stage for this program. For many years, curators have been contending with the colonial and white supremacist legacies of the museum and trying to find ways to shift curatorial and institutional practices to foster an anti-racist, decolonial, and intersectional space. But with its entrenched structures, it has been more than a challenge to implement necessary changes. This year, however, with the onset of a global pandemic, the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, and too many Black folks to name killed at the hands of police in just this year alone, and recently the miscarriage of justice for Breonna Taylor, the passing of trailblazing Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a contentious presidential election upcoming, and with each day more alarming news stories, we have seen, to say the least, the limitations of and precarity in our belief in our longstanding institutions. In tandem, these events have engendered even more robust as well as public conversations around transforming our institutions, including museums, which have been put under public scrutiny for upholding racist, exclusionary, and inequitable systems. There's still a lot of work to be done, as evidenced even with the swift and varied responses around the quite recent decision to postpone the Philip Guston exhibition, organized by the National Gallery, Tate Modern, MFA Houston, and MFA Boston. So it's with this framework for this year's Root Lecture, I wanted to have this discussion with key figures leading not just these dialogues, but also really rethinking and changing curatorial and institutional practices through their work. There's only so much we can address within this brief time frame, but we'll touch upon as much as we can in this hour. So to introduce our distinguished speakers. Yesomi Umolu is director and curator at the Logan Center Exhibitions, University of Chicago, where she leads an ambitious program of international contemporary art focused on emerging interdisciplinary practices. Umolu teaches courses in contemporary visual art and spatial practices as a lecturer in the humanities division. Prior to the Logan, she held curatorial positions at the MSU Broad Museum, Walker Art Center, and Manifesta 8. She has contributed to programming at the Serpentine Galleries and Tate Modern in London. Umolu has worked on solo exhibitions and commissioned projects with Ensemble, John Acumpra, Mike Cloud, Mariana Castillo-Debal, Kapwani Kiwanga, Candice Lynn, Harold Mendez, Camille Normant, Karthik Pandian, and Andrewsons Brown, among others. As artistic director of the 2019 Chicago Architecture Biennial, Umolu oversaw a critically acclaimed program featuring new commissions, offsite installations, as well as performances, talks, and community engagements with over 80 international contributors. Umolu is a 2016 recipient of the Andy Warhol Foundation for Visual Arts Curatorial Fellowship. She has been a visiting lecturer and critic at numerous universities, including Williams College, University College London, University of Michigan, University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg, among others. She served on the curatorial advisory board for the US Pavilion at the 16th Venice Architecture Biennale, and she's also a trustee of the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in Fine Arts in Chicago. Jasmine Wahey is the Holly Block Social Justice Curator at the Bronx Museum of the Arts and the founder and co-director of Project for Empty Space, or PES. Her practice predominantly focuses on issues of female empowerment, complicating binary structures within social discourses, and exploring multi-positional cultural identities through the lens of intersectional feminism. In 2010, Wahi co-founded Project for Empty Space, a nonprofit organization that supports artists interested in social discourse and activism. In 2019, Wahi joined Rebecca Jampol to open a brick and mortar gallery for PES in Newark, New Jersey. Additionally, Wahi curates independent exhibitions, projects, and public interventions. Select highlights include No Means No in 2017, a significant public action confronting rape culture with 15 other artists. She served as the co-chair for the College Art Association's Day of Panels for the Feminist Art Project in 2018, organizing a day of intersectional feminist-based performances, films, and conversations on rape, representation, and radicality. In 2019, Wahi joined the TED speaker family with her first TEDx talk on intersectionality and visibility, entitled All the Women in Me Are Tired. Thus far in 2020, Wahi curated and co-organized a series of exhibitions such as Abortion is Normal around reproductive rights in New York City, and her work has been featured widely. Notable publications include Art Forum, New York Times, Hyperallergic, Art News, Artsy, Vogue, and Breitbart News. Wahi is a visiting critic at Yale University and a faculty member of the School of Visual Arts. She is a former board member of Speak Mentorship and the South Asian Women's Creative Collective, and a former volunteer instructor for the Girls Educational Mentoring Services Group. And I say all that, you can see why I wanted to invite these two speakers. So Yesomi and Jasmine, thank you so much for being here and for taking part in this program. So I'd like to start off with a question that at least introduces you and your work to our audiences. So just a very general question for each of you about how you approach your work. Jasmine, as I read in your bio, your work focuses on issues of female empowerment, complicating binary structures within social discourses, exploring multi-positional cultural identities through the lens of intersectional feminism. So can you talk about how you've manifested that through your work, or if you want to focus on any particular projects you want to highlight, and how you envision expounding upon this work at the Bronx Museum?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm really thrilled to be here, and hello to everyone who I can't see but can see me. So as far as my practice goes, I think I've gone through kind of an evolution in the past few years, but particularly I would say it's come to a head in the past few months, actually, with abortion is normal in particular. Actually, at this point, it's probably a year now. But my interest, as you mentioned, really is exploring intersectional spaces and creating dialogues that are communities oriented. So not community singular, but rather focusing on kind of a Venn diagram of where various communities intersect and can be seen in institutional spaces. My primary interest right now is kind of following up a thesis that I've developed for the Bronx Museum's 50th anniversary, which is that visibility is the primary or is a primary tenet of social justice. And the way to create visibility, or actually, let me back up. The reason I say that is because part of the issue that we have within social politics right now is a lack of awareness, or in some cases, a deliberate ignorance of communities outside of the framework of our own community. And part of combating injustice is being able to see it. And so my interest as a curator is creating spaces of visibility and also reconstructing narratives, particularly historical narratives, which in the institutional space, in my opinion, historically have been through a hegemonic white and colonialist lens. And so what I try to do is to create opportunities to deconstruct that lens and then reconstruct it through the voices of the lived experience of those communities and cultures that I am hoping to include in my exhibitions. And so my vision now as a curator is actually to remove the triangle structure of curating, where there's a curator at the top and everyone, both as peers who are working together on an exhibition, but also artists, rather than be part of a top-down structure, I'm part of more of a lateral structure. So Egyptian period versus Mayan period for pyramid for everyone who's a art history nerd like me. And so I'm interested in this idea of collaborative curating, where I bring in, for example, one of the shows that I'm doing, I'm bringing in members of the Ball or Vogue community to curate a show with me, where really I'm just kind of the logistical facilitator, and am interested more in the narrative structures written by community members rather than written simply by me. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah,
And that
no,
was a very long answer, I'm sorry.
No, and we'll definitely touch upon community later on. But Yesomi, I'd love, a similar question for you. You've expressed your practice as nurturing emerging interdisciplinary practices, unearthing subverted narratives, and building affinities through creative engagement. So it'd be great if you can elaborate on that and how you've been able to do so in your work.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. It's lovely to join everyone. And Jasmine, this is the first time we've ever had to kind of like engage thoroughly in each other's work. So I'm really excited about this platform that's been created. Yeah, I think it's interesting whenever looking at a curator's trajectory to think of where they're coming from. And I think that's often not kind of articulated when you think about mainstream curatorial practice, because maybe one assumes a sort of like uniformity of background and experience that kind of brings you to institutional work. So for example, you might have, trained as an art historian, done a couple of internships in major institutions, and then landed at a kind of like final central institution. And for the most part, maybe we can say that, especially if you're kind of based in Europe or the US, that your kind of art historical training would have been through the sort of like Western lens. And that sort of kind of, maybe kind of like universal curatorial background, I think is often assumed and kind of remains invisible, talking about visibility and invisibility, remains as a sort of like invisible hand and maybe kind of power broker within museums. And I think for me, when I think of my practice, and at least I believe that kind of curatorial practice is very subjective. And, you know, art history is about interpretation, and you interpret art history through a particular lens. And for me, my practice has always been trying to acknowledge what my lens is and how it might relate to other people who might share similar experiences with artistic practice. So I can kind of confidently say that I'm someone that didn't go through a traditional art historical route. In fact, I came through architectural design, but had always been very much involved in museum practice. And actually the way I got into museums was through education, was through community engagement. So my thinking around curatorial practice was always about a sort of democratized space and a sort of like collective engagement. And then increasingly thinking about how one can kind of develop that within a kind of curatorial framework within various institutions. And I think by virtue of my background, I'm, you know, interested in interdisciplinary work. I like thinking about questions of emergence because I think that I came from a generation of curators where we were kind of, you know, the first kind of arrive into institutions coming from quote unquote diverse backgrounds and sort of maybe introducing a new voice, a new perspective into kind of mainstream practice. So this idea of emergence is something that I see as part of my sort of trajectory as a curator. And it's something that I like to think about nurturing when I work with artists who are also kind of like emerging, you know, and bringing something new to the table, as it were. And I think also, if I think again of my background, been of a sort of like diasporic heritage and coming from the UK, where I was very much trained in a sort of post-colonial lens and trying to think about this question of kind of multiple art histories and multiple canons, that continues to be something that I see as central to my work, and I think is increasingly urgent to the work of institutions. So it's often hard, and I think that as a curator, my profile can be kind of difficult to pin down at times. But I think this sort of multiplicity of experience is really kind of what grounds my practice and the types of artists and practitioners that I'm interested in.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And kind of as a follow-up, you know, because especially we have a lot of students in the audience, I'd love, I mean, both of you kind of touched upon why you entered the field, how you entered the field, and, you know, how you got interested in curatorial practice. But I think it would be helpful also to hear your impressions and perhaps the challenges that you face. You know, Yesomi, as you were saying, you didn't have this like quote unquote traditional kind of curatorial trajectory, but I also can imagine that that wasn't necessarily the easiest to kind of enter into a realm that had been relatively prescribed. So especially for some of the younger folks who are interested in this field, you know, what were some of those impressions? And again, the challenges that you faced on your professional journeys. Jasmine, I'll start with you.
I was going to say start with Yesomi because I have a laundry list. But no, happy to start. So I actually also did not. I came from an art history background, but full disclosure, the Bronx Museum is my first largish institutional job, and the primary reason for that is because I resisted entering into that space because personally I have always found it a space of mostly passive but sometimes active violence. Although I did grow up in the Smithsonian, I knew from the time I was 8 years old that I wanted to be a curator.
Wow.
Which is sort of strange. They say the thing that you want to do in kindergarten is often what you end up being happiest doing as an adult. So I guess in my case, that's what it is. But for me, in not seeing myself in the way I wanted to be seen in museum spaces, I ultimately decided to make my own thing, which was Project for Empty Space, and do so in a way that I felt could be unrestricted by some of the politics and censorship that have been happening throughout my whole life in museum spaces. And of course, as we see now this year and last year have come to a particular head. But the challenges I think that I have faced for the most part have been people saying that either my ideas are too radical and the exhibitions that I curate or my approach to exhibition making is radical in its approach because of the types of artists who I may work with, or the way I enjoy showing exhibitions as trying to make them as accessible as possible. I think, and I recently had this realization, the majority of issues I've had, I think, come from being perhaps misunderstood, or as I like to put it, a little bit spicy for the white box space. And I guess for students, what I did was kind of with Project for Empty Space, which is turning 10 years old this year, was when things were in a financially dire place in 2009 and 10, I basically naively called up the city of New York and said, do you have any vacant spaces where I could do an art project? And I called 311. For those of you who are in New York or any other places where there's an information hotline for your city, it probably would never work for anyone else again. It just happened to work out for me that I called the city and I asked them this question and they were like, oh yeah, sure. And that was sort of the beginning of the end. And I say it's naive, but I think it's also sometimes about in the face of challenge or adversity or lack of opportunity, one has to make their own opportunity. And you know, this is my sort of after school special moment, but the worst thing that you can do for yourself if you're interested in creating an exhibition or starting a business or whatever it is not ask. Because the worst thing by asking that can happen is you get a no, or it goes nowhere, but at least you've tried. So yeah, I think my challenges have been about what others perceive me to be and not necessarily who I am or my talents in the field. And that again is something that it's taken me a very long time to come to realize.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's something that, frankly, I know that myself, I struggle with that as well. Yesomi, I'd love for your insights as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to think about, maybe it's easy to see the challenges in hindsight, because I think that we all have a very kind of individual path. So it's often difficult once you're in it to know whether or not your path is kind of like more favorable than the next person. You're just trying to kind of get through. And I think one thing we know about this kind of field and this discipline is that, you know, it can be kind of a labor of love. We work with artists who are kind of, you know, in this because of their passions. And I think similarly with curators, a lot of curators would say, you know, no one's in this for the kind of huge paycheck or the glory, but it's something kind of maybe that is intrinsic to who we are as people, and something that we feel that we need to kind of do as part of our kind of journeys in the world. So I think my challenges, anyways, if I think about it in hindsight now, I think my challenges would have been kind of maybe trying to find mentors that I could map my background and interests and trajectories onto and say, okay, I see that person and I know that that's where I need to kind of be. And I think that there are obviously key mentors that I looked to when I was kind of emerging, such as Okwe and Wezo or Ho Hanru, but they weren't necessarily kind of in close proximity to me to have conversations, you know, guidance and etc. I just had to kind of look from afar and try to kind of interpret what their movements were and what their priorities were, and see if I felt that I could kind of, you know, follow that journey as well.
Mm.
I happen to kind of emerge in the UK context in a sort of time of kind of very kind of strong support for the arts in the UK, which has kind of seen a steady decline in the last kind of like 10 years or so. And there was a lot of interest in new knowledge and new research, in new perspectives, and in creating kind of a cultural ecosystem for the UK that had never existed before. So I think I kind of emerged at a time when there was a lot of openness and willingness for kind of my participation. And in some ways, maybe that was easier for me than if I had tried to kind of enter the field 10 years prior or something like that. And I was easily able to kind of navigate my way from an interest in architectural design and working into practice to moving into kind of curatorial work and to kind of working within institutions. I still think that not having that sort of classical art historical training, which if I had known that you could train as an art historian, maybe I would have selected that earlier on. But I think maybe that might have been like a little bit of a hindrance to me, but I've always found ways to kind of like overcome that and I guess bring something else to the table.
Yeah, no, I mean, kind of as a semi follow-up, you know, when I first entered the field and it's great to hear that you were able to kind of move through those spaces no matter the challenges. I remember when I first entered the field in the mid to late 2000s, and it was the contemporary art scene in New York. You know, people really seemed to aspire to, or were told to aspire to, you know, whether implicitly or explicitly, the status of the, you know, the star curator. So there was this kind of cult of personality around the figure, and there was this emphasis on finding the next big artist or art star. You know, and New York is very much a marketplace, and you know that still persists. You know, perhaps enhanced by social media as well. And as I mentioned, they're all tied to market pressures, and for museums also, you know, admissions and fundraising pressures. But for myself, as someone who sees themselves as communally oriented, in the last few years, we've definitely seen a bit more public conversation around demystifying, at the very least, curatorial institutional practices to prioritize, you know, transparency and engagement with the community, which you both kind of already touched upon. And it's especially this year, but that takes a range of forms, you know, depending on what institutions and contexts you're in. And we've, you know, I guess we've seen also varying levels of success, you know, however you can measure that. So I'd love to hear you talk about, as you move through your trajectories, how your practice, as well as the field in your eyes, have evolved or shifted over time. And Jasmine, I'll start with you again, because when I told folks about this program, you know, many people said to me, they're like, they've never heard about this position, you know, social justice curator. So it'd be great to hear your thoughts, and again, how your practice has changed, especially now you're in an institutional space.
Yeah, well, I think I'll start with the position, the title that was created after our late director, Holly Block, who was herself a champion of social justice and also a champion of emerging artists and artist practice, particularly around New York. And, you know, for me, I guess the title or the position for some reason doesn't seem that remarkable to me, as in the sense that it's just sort of a given that this position would exist. And I didn't actually really realize going into it that as far as I know, I'm the only social justice curator, which is, I think, actually quite, you know, it's nice for me to have this sort of inaugural position, but I think the lack of other positions like it is indicative of a much larger problem. And what my hope is long term is that the need for the title social justice curator will dissipate, because I think that all institutions, regardless of the department or the type of work that curators are working with, social justice should be a consideration always, even if you're working with geometric abstraction or work that is primarily concerned with formalism or pure aesthetics. All of that actually has social concerns and can be looked at through the lens of intersectionality. And so, you know, my long-term hope is that the idea of a singular position dedicated to this idea will disappear, and it'll become sort of a new normal for these ideas to just be percolating across institutions. And I also think that the existence of this type of position, while, you know, it's interesting at the Bronx Museum, it feels a bit redundant to have the title because that's a type of work that the curators before me and Holly were trying to infuse into the institution. And also it's kind of grounded in the mission of the institution to be communities oriented and to be activist or engagement oriented. But I see it as potentially being becoming this silo within other institutions that gives them an excuse to kind of push off these concerns to one specific department, and everyone else kind of gets a free pass to carry on as normal. Hopefully I'm wrong in that regard, and hopefully the wave or the shift that's happening with the tide right now will really kind of barrel over into some kind of systemic change. I will say that in the, I don't know, 10 to 15 years that I've been in the New York art world, I have seen somewhat of a shift. Jessica, like you were mentioning, I think there has been a shift from the superstar curator to more of a holistic or collaborative approach between curators and artists, where the artists hopefully have equal weight in their presence. You know, it's interesting. I often say to my students, everyone loves the art, but no one really loves the artist, which isn't entirely true. But I think often in institutional spaces, the way that shows are marketed and presented is with superstar curator at the top again. And then for group shows, for example, artists include, and then there's a list of artists rather than it being the other way around. Of course, it's different for solo shows. But I think there has been a dynamic shift in the acknowledgement of artists. And again, I think a rise in the presence of BIPOC artists in particular, and a visibility for queer, trans artists of color as well, in a way that feels, I think it started out as tokenizing and is gradually, and maybe this is me just wearing rose-colored glasses, but is, I think, shifting dynamically to become a more sustainable and hopefully academic interest, because as we've seen in the past several cycles of economic downturn, we often have these art market bubbles because the market and the secondary market in particular dictate our valuation of certain types of art rather than vice versa, where the art is valued for its intrinsic, intellectual, spiritual, et cetera, value. Mm-hmm. And so what I hope is happening, and I think is happening, is that we are creating more scholarship and conversation and discourse around artists who, I'll use this phrase even though I hate it, historically have been on the margins. Mm-hmm. And that's my perception, at least. It could simply be a New York thing. And I think the two of you will have to tell me if my gauge is correct outside of New York, but that's my impression, at least here.
Yeah, Yesomi, could you also respond?
Yeah, I always like to say, I mean, I work in a context where kind of community is always kind of, and I think we often in institutions think of community as the other, but I always like to think that in museums, we work with numerous communities, right. You know, those that are internal and those that are external, and that we need to kind of give equal weight to our engagement with all these communities. Whereas I think we often think of like community as like out there, and communities is something that we have to cater to in some ways that we aren't quite sure how or why, but we know we have to do it because they're there, you know. And I don't think that's how it is in reality. And I think that our communities are much more kind of integrated. And I think there's been lots of different ways of thinking of how, whether or not you think about audience, community, how you think about engagement, participation, activism within the museums. There have been like these different waves of interest that have primarily come through artists' work and kind of artists' own interest in kind of engaging a variety of different communities. And then others that have come from like museum work, kind of like community-based organizing within institutions or the work of education departments, et cetera, and et cetera. And I wonder why at this point, it seems like maybe this question of like engagement and community, audience, etc., is starting to kind of knock at the door of curatorial in terms of like curatorial departments. And it's seemingly a matter of urgency that like curatorial departments should kind of be interested in engaging with communities beyond artists and art and things beyond like artworks. And maybe that's what we're seeing now, is this sort of realization within the curatorial field that, you know, there is this sort of other way of working and this other art historical kind of practice that is not just about the kind of like autonomous art object. And obviously this is something that we've always known, and even in looking at artist practice from like the kind of like historical European avant-garde, they're working in different ways that aren't about the kind of object itself, but there is still the kind of centering of the artist's work. And I think that now maybe there's more care or more interest in thinking about like who's out there to kind of receive this work, how are they receiving it, how we kind of speak into, you know, our audiences, our communities, and what are the needs, you know. And I think, of course, there are people who, as Jasmine said, there are institutions who have been doing this work and it has been their kind of part of their missions. And there's some institutions that are coming to this kind of anew because they've been focused on other things. And I think that certainly the kind of broader social context where it's seemingly clear that they're like audiences are asking hard questions about their institutions, especially I think in a time when there's a lot of kind of skepticism around institutions and certain levels of expertise. And it's almost like our audiences are pushing back to say, you know, you need to kind of attend to us more, attend to us differently. And I think that's what this moment is sort of like exposed, something that has probably always already been there, but I think that maybe how we understand curatorial work has been able to occupy itself with a whole host of other things, whereas now, you know, it's at the door. And the question is, are we going to open the door and like, you know, shift the practice and kind of like advance our work, or are we going to kind of try and, you know, hide away from it?
Yeah.
And I think it's a very kind of interesting moment for institutions, because it's again back to this idea of what is your commitment to addressing questions of community engagement or social justice. And that commitment cannot just be kind of a fleeting thing. It's something that has to be mission driven over the long term. And I like to think that this is something that is not new to institutions, because we do have like a civic duty. And that civic duty might have been interpreted before as, you know, museums, you know, being these like pedagogical spaces to kind of disseminate information downwards, whereas maybe like our civic mission right now is to be with the people on the ground, working with them, with artists through kind of what are seemingly major challenges for our society.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a great segue. I mean, Yesomi, in your recent article on the limits of care and knowledge, 15 points museums must understand to dismantle structural injustice, which garnered a lot of attention. And I encourage all of our audiences to read the article. So you suggest also prioritizing care as part of institutional practice. And, to be frank, museums have rarely used that term, care. And if they do, it's often, as you said, it's kind of in this very object-focused way, in the context of caring for the objects that they're stewarding, and not necessarily the audiences or even their staff that's carrying out the labor on behalf of the institution. So I'd love for you to expound upon that, especially for our audience members who may not have read the entire article, but how museums can foreground care. And as an example, how you've been doing so at your institutions and or whatever role that kind of you functioned in.
Yeah, I mean, the article, I think has been as a surprise to me, like the success of it, as it has probably
Oh,
to
really?
everybody else. But it kind of came, I think it came from a place of being able to kind of like step back and watch what was happening in response to the sort of murder of George Floyd, and how institutions were or were not responding to what I think is going to go down as kind of like a historical moment in the history of this country, and broadly speaking, probably in the history of the world, and how institutions were sort of struggling with their sort of civic responsibility to kind of pay attention to what's happening out there, whilst at the same time trying to maintain a certain sense of like distance or neutrality, and just struggling with that sort of I think predicament, and how they responded, and some of the backlash and the disappointment and the kind of like counter responses. And having been in institutions for well over a decade, understanding how this response, which was obviously on this sort of like macro scale to this major issue, could be kind of traced down to kind of micro things that we see in institutions, whether it is to do with diversity of collections, diversity of curatorial staff, work and labor, and how institutions exploit the labor of artists, of curators, of et cetera, because of a certain business model. And maybe that sort of kind of like uncertainty has been something that's like built into a sort of like institutional model. And in this case, it was clear that the institutions, it's not that I think we wanted them to have the answer, because it was such a kind of troubled moment that who knows what the answer would have been to kind of like to cater to all the kind of sadness and bitterness and disappointment that was in the air. But it wasn't even that they didn't have the answer. It's like they didn't even care to find a way. And I think that was what was the most shocking to me, in ways of like censoring certain comments or not dealing with issues directly when brought up by their employees. And I think that was like a marker of like gross negligence of one's civic duty, because wherever you stand, and I like to think that wherever you stand, I hate this word when everyone talks about politicized institutions or politicized art. I think everything is political. It just depends on what side you're sitting on. And it's not a question of whether or not the moment would be politicized. It was a question, I think, of basic human rights and human decency, and listening to a world that was clearly in pain, and trying to find a way to be generous to kind of attend to that world. And I think that's really, it's been an interesting moment. And I think that there's been a lot of soul searching within institutions, within museum leadership, curators, who have tried to kind of grapple with that moment, and maybe kind of like our inefficacy in dealing with it. And not to say that I have a practice that, is so enlightened that one can kind of like address such a kind of catastrophic moment. But I think that there are certain practitioners and ways of working where care is centered. And I think we think about care differently. I'm working with an artist now, and I really care that I finish his publication because I know it means a lot to him. Or when I was working on the biennial, we were working with social movements in Brazil, and I really cared to kind of make sure that the budget that we spent on their project, the majority of it was not spent on an installation in Chicago, but the majority of it was spent in Brazil to kind of like facilitate the work of this social movement. And so it's in those decision making and thinking about how we use our spaces, our resources, our sort of like intellectual capital, and how we use it in a way that maybe attends to the needs of others, and less to ourselves, you know, as curators and as institutions, you know. And maybe it's a sense of kind of just like being much more nuanced in the way that we do that work. And I think that we will see in the months and the years to come what the real impact of this moment is on institutional work. But it's clear, and I think it has been clear for a number of years, beyond this kind of summer that we've had, it's clear that institutions need to think about their constituents differently and think about the way in which they kind of care for their constituents differently.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jasmine, I mean, you've also been committed to this, you know, to care in your practice. So I'd love to get your thoughts on care and the role that it plays in your work, especially today.
Sure. Yesomi, I'm such a fangirl. I'm having trouble thinking about a way to say anything differently from what you've just said and what you've written. But I guess briefly, I'll just say, I think my practice has always been centered around being duly focused on audiences and artists and trying to support those in whatever way I can. And so to reference back, I'm going to reference back to the show that I mentioned in the first place, because it's really also the only show that has been shared publicly so far, that's upcoming. But in this exhibition around ball culture, is really important for me to do, and to do it in the way that I am, which is bringing on community members as curatorial partners, and also having all of the artists involved in the show, though many of them, I would say almost all of them, are not sort of like household names in the art world as we consider the art world in a sort of formal sense. But the reason that I want to do this show is because I think that the ball community, and it's a show that I've been thinking about for about 6 years now, really deserves to have a moment where the community's story is told through their own lens. And I think a lot has been done in the past 30 to 40 years through the lens of voyeurism. So you have films like Paris is Burning, and you also have examples of gross appropriation, cultural appropriation by artists like Madonna, and then a variety of other documentaries and shows that have painted a picture, and this is not just specific to the ball community, it's just what I'm focusing on now. And I think that that community and some of the other communities I'm working with not only deserve, but it is their right to be present in spaces that purport to be communities oriented. And the only way to make those shows successful and also ethical is to create structures of care and create structures of further community and camaraderie in order for people to feel comfortable enough and to feel comfortable within the space that they are in. And, you know, I'll sort of anecdotally share that some artists who are participating in the show have expressed to me that they have found galleries or museums to be spaces that are extremely unwelcoming. And part of my role as trying to, I think, reorient or maybe orient for the first time sorry, dog, because orient certain types of institutional spaces to feel safe is by, again, creating this architecture of welcoming space and trying to mitigate this sense of exclusion that many people have dealt with. And so I think one of the things that I meant to say in the beginning as part of how my curatorial practice has changed, and this is really, I think, kind of a linchpin moment for me was Abortion is Normal, is my interest is now not so much in creating exhibitions that prioritize everyone equally, even though I'm try to be as lateral of a thinker as possible. But I do create priorities to create safety and caring for the communities that I am addressing. And I'm not so much interested as a social justice curator in trying to convince outsiders or audiences who lack the ability to relate or see the value in something. I'm not interested in trying to validate the existence of the art I'm showing or the artists I'm showing or the communities that I'm showing. And I say that Abortion Was Normal was a turning point for me because I dealt with a lot of backlash from that exhibition, although the crowning achievement of my career to date was being on the front page of Breitbart. But you know, I learned with that show that most people have staunch and deeply rooted ideas about what they think is right and wrong. And within many spaces, those of us who operate as radical or other, or people who historically have not been allowed, we need community and we need to see ourselves in spaces that are not considered radical, but simply considered to be regular. And that I would say is at the root now of what my interest is being able to see ourselves and being able to sort of, to use a phrase that's been used quite widely recently, is to dog whistle to others like us in a way that creates community, and to let people know that we are here and we're just like you. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I honestly could talk to you all evening, and I'm realizing now that we're almost at the end. So I'm going to.
Sorry.
No. I mean, we started a few minutes late, so I think we can extend a little bit. But I did want to get to a couple of questions from the audience, and it seems like people are really kind of picking up on this idea of care as part of institutional practice. And my colleague Jamie Powell asks or says, "Thank you for your comments on care. Centering practices of care within curatorial work is something I'm incredibly interested in. So can you talk about some of the challenges and victories you've had in doing this work?"
Yeah, maybe I could talk about, you started with the land acknowledgement, Jessica, and one of the major moves we made as part of the Chicago Architecture Biennial was to work with the American Indian Center of Chicago on a land acknowledgement that would sort of welcome people into the space. And I think I would say that when we started thinking about, and there are a variety of reasons why we decided to kind of make that move. We had done some research in Vancouver, and we were broadly interested in kind of trying to unearth kind of, minor histories in terms of thinking about architecture in Chicago. And one cannot think about architectural space in Chicago without thinking about Indigenous histories and their erasure, but also their continued kind of presence within the city. And in wanting to kind of make that move and to, I guess, maybe bring to the forefront the injustices that have been perpetrated against Indigenous peoples, I can say that not everyone in the room was very welcoming about that move. Not in maybe a sort of malicious manner, but maybe more in a sort of like hypersensitive manner, and not wanting to kind of, you know, dig things up that people couldn't kind of take account for fully or could deal with fully. And a lot of our work there was trying to, first of all, share the practice of land acknowledgement, which I think when we did it in the exhibition at the Chicago Architecture Biennial, it was probably one of the first times that that's been done within the US context, which kind of directly acknowledges the histories of secular colonialism here in the US. And now it has subsequently been something that has become a practice that I'm happy to know that we kind of preempted that. Is to kind of understand that in order to welcome people in, you have to acknowledge them. And part of acknowledging them is to acknowledge their present and their histories. And one cannot just gloss over the sort of very challenging and difficult histories that some communities have. But also it makes, I think it was an attempt to think differently about spatial practice and architecture in the city, and moving it away from a sort of like grand modernist kind of lexicon, and thinking about it in relation to kind of power and land and exploitation and extraction and cultivation of land through kind of indigenous forms of knowledge. And I think that that was an ongoing conversation that we had to sort of maybe instill confidence in those in the room, that by making this move, we were going to do our due diligence to make sure that not only were we kind of attending to the communities that the land acknowledgement was directly speaking of, but also attending to other communities who would have been coming to this land acknowledgement maybe very fresh with very little knowledge or not really understanding what it was meant to do within the space. And all those different layers, I think, in terms of thinking about community work and how you do have to be kind of, you have to excavate the different layers, right? You have to work through each different kind of context, each different community differently. All those different layers were something that we felt confident that we were able to do in order to make sure that this thing could sit at the front of, you know, both entrances of the biennial and be received by everyone with a sort of like parity of vision. And so I would say that that was one of the challenges, which was unexpected, to try and actually understand the nuances of the sensitivities around what it meant to acknowledge Indigenous histories within the US context, and then how to overcome that by instilling confidence in not just the land acknowledgement, but in our processes and practices for how we got to that acknowledgement.
No, absolutely. And I do want to recognize that Jamie Powell actually wrote the land acknowledgement that we recite at our public programs, and we've also, with inspiration with a lot of the scholars on campus doing this work, including Professor Deborah King, who's in our sociology department, looking at the legacies of enslavement on campus, wanting to incorporate the legacies of enslavement into our acknowledgement, that this is the origins of the institution. But the next question I'll give to Jasmine, it's from Armando Pulido, who was my former intern, and I'm so happy he's here. He's now at the Whitney Museum. So his question is there a way to enact care or reparations with permanent collections? If we weren't able to completely disband and redistribute museum collections, what can we do with these often large holdings to address a deeply colonial practice of collecting?
Ooh, well, are you ready for another lecture? That's a really good question. I guess maybe, not sure if I should clarify. Are you asking if what we should do with existing collections, or moving forward, how we can decolonize collections?
I mean, because he's, oh, there we go.
Okay.
Both.
Well, I think, you know, I have a lot of thoughts about what institutions in the move to revisit histories and their approach to their current collections, which I think, you know, and the idealist in me thinks repatriation is a great option, but I think the logistics person in me thinks that there's much more nuance to that conversation than simply saying, give it all back or redistribute all of it. Because there are elements of value in the logistics or operations of how objects are kept and have been kept. So I think that, you know, that's something that requires a lot more thought and that I need to think about more. But as far as moving forward with collections, I think that museums need to take a much stronger and deliberate move to decide what they will be collecting in the future. And perhaps this is an unpopular opinion, but I think for the next 10, 20, or 30 years, institutions should make that vested effort to collect artwork by Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, and not as just simply to do it, but I think, and there's an argument that I hear all the time about merit-based versus simply whatever people interpret affirmative action to be, which for some reason people seem to think is just collecting something based on the identity of the person. However, I don't believe that is the case, and I think we as institutions, particularly American and European institutions, have only focused on collecting colonial objects when they are objects by non-white artists. And the rest of the time we've spent our collections money, particularly in contemporary, on art mostly by white men. And I'll just say it because I'm a candid person. Most of those artists, or many of those artists, I'll be a little bit more polite, but many of those artists, frankly, I consider to be very mediocre white men. And since we've done that for centuries, I think maybe it's time to do a little catch up and put our time, energy, and resources into collecting art by people of color. And part of collections is the legacy and the scholarship that goes with that, which I think it is of the utmost importance to create collections that allow for that dialogue and discourse to happen in a sustainable and long-term manner.
Great, thank you so much. I think, Sharon, do we have time for one more? I know that we're a few minutes over. I wish I could get to everything.
I think we can take one more question.
Okay. I'm just going to go down the list. Rebecca McNamara, who's actually a colleague and curator from Tang. Can you all talk about more about the idea that Jasmine mentioned about who we curate for? I might be an idealist, but as a curator, I still believe museums can be used to open and broaden minds for a better future and build bridges between divergent perspectives. But how or do we need to make everyone feel welcome in our galleries, which at least in my case, often have clearly progressive, social justice-oriented messages?
I think it's important in order to, museums have to be representative. They have to be representative of their constituency. And if a museum is in a constituency like New York, they have to represent New Yorkers, not just the New Yorkers with the most wealth, but the broad spectrum of New Yorkers. And they have to do that on their boards, in their programming teams, their curatorial teams, their education departments, their docents. They have to do it all the way through. And I think if museums become representative, then we would be less concerned about the question of, do we need to welcome everyone at the same level? because then it becomes just a daily practice that people walk in, we see a variety of different people from different experiences, social backgrounds. There's a sense of identification that happens at a variety of different levels, that it starts becoming less work in terms of something that we're fighting to do, and it just becomes a way of being. And I think that's really, really important to think about questions of being representative. And I think, just to go back to the previous questions about museum collections, we cannot forget that a lot of these kind of classical collections come with a sort of like disciplinary bias, coming from anthropology, sort of like material cultures, ways of collecting traditional art, that have kind of permeated through academia and then entered into museum practice. So it's a certain discipline to work with these objects in a very kind of specific way. Whether or not you think about what that means, thinking about the history of colonialism in relation to anthropology and kind of like material cultures as a specialism. And so I think it's really important that maybe we are willing to relinquish some of that expertise, quote unquote expertise, and bring others to the table that might be able to offer a different level of expertise, which does not diminish, it's just different, you know? And I think that's a real kind of grappling point in terms of, if you have a collection of African art or a collection of kind of oceanic art or a collection of kind of Native American art, there are disciplines that deal with those kind of in a very specific way. How courageous are we to say, we're going to bring in someone that isn't from the traditional kind of sphere of interpreting these works, and we're going to bring in a different perspective? So what does it mean to have a Native American curator who actually curates a Native American collection, or a contemporary kind of Afro-diasporic curator who's curating a traditional African art collection? I think that would be very exciting to do. And I think there are a lot of people who would take that on, but institutions have to be ready and willing to relinquish their claims to expertise in these areas. And I think that is where we are right now. And we will watch closely to see if the way of dealing with these collections is not only to kind of think about interpretation more broadly, but is actually to change who takes care of the collections on a day-to-day basis.
Jasmine, I'll give you the last word.
I don't think I have anything further to say. I think Yesomi again summed it up really well.
Well, with that, I want to thank you both so much for being with us and having this really critical dialogue, which I hope is one of many. But and thank you all to the audience for spending your time with us, being here with us. I wish we could have gotten to all the questions. Hopefully we can have these dialogues in person sometime soon. And Yesomi, Jasmine, again, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you all for joining. Bye.
We do ask that you take a moment to complete a short survey that will be emailed tomorrow, and we encourage you to visit and subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you'll find many of our recorded programs to view at your leisure. And I know several of you asked about seeing Yesomi's article that was referenced, and I'm sure we can send that link out also in the follow-up email. We'll be happy to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.